And again, I know people are just coming in and whatnot. If I mute everyone to begin with, but if you have questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and hop in. You're always more than welcome to. All right. So what you're going to want to look at during your review is the statutes and the regulations. The regulations are designed by the state board. They sit down, they write these things up, and these are normally considerably longer than the statutes. The statutes are everything that goes through the legislative body. And again, not that you need to know the numbers on these, but it's just, I just put it in there as a point of reference. If you go to the state board's website, you can find both the statutes and the regulations. When I was a student, it was just one big book that they would send out. And like, I remember looking at Pennsylvania's was like 20 pages was the one, and like 35 was the other. New Jersey was like 285 pages. They go overkill on these things in New Jersey, and we'll talk about some of the things that you need to know for this, because it's just New Jersey. We go crazy with our laws in the state. So again, other examples, you don't need to remember these. You don't need to memorize them. It's something like that. I just put them in as a point of reference. Health and vital statistics. Again, that plays a role in funeral service, corporate names, medical examiner, advanced funeral payments, trust accounts, tax waivers. This is where you can track all of this information down. Some of these slides I intentionally did not, like, normally when I'm teaching class, I normally have a Microsoft Surface sitting here, and I've got all the answers that I need to know. Like anybody that took laws, rules, and regs, I can sit in class and say, oh, here's how long it is. You have to tell the state board if you have had a change of address, and I've got the answer written in front of me when I'm doing it. I intentionally don't do that here because I want to encourage everyone to just look these things up. I have found that if you review it on your own, it seems to stick a little bit better. So, all right. So basic concepts, the difference between a license and certificate of registration. The COR is with the funeral home. The license is with the individual. Death certificate, burial permit. Technically, years ago, what it used to be was you had the death certificate, you took it to the township, you gave it to a state official. They looked at it and said, okay, I put my stamp, my seal of approval on this, and I give you a burial permit. You are allowed to have this disposition occur. The lines have been a little bit blurred because of EDRS, because you don't need to wait for the state to actually do that. You don't need to wait for the state's approval to print the burial permit or the disposition permit. Burial permit versus transit permit. And again, if I'm going too fast, just tell me. I'm still getting used to this whole online world. The burial permit, the burial permit magically transforms into a transit permit when you click a button in EDRS and just go, yes, I'm going to be shipping somebody via common carrier. And then magically it becomes a transit permit. All right, so in prep for this, remember, what do you need a license for? New Jersey's pretty strict about this, and I agree with this, but arranging, don't mind that. If you can hear kids in the background, it's my 2-year-old. She makes a lot of noise. All right, arranging and pre-arranging. So you can't, there are many states in the union that you do not need a license for to make pre-arrangements. New Jersey is not one of them. You need to have that license to be able to do that and to be able to sell merchandise and sign forms, meaning that you can't sign a statement of funeral goods and services unless you're licensed. As an intern, if the funeral director does it, that's fine, and then you handle those arrangements. But I couldn't. My wife works at a funeral home. I couldn't just sign off on statement of funeral goods and services to have her make the set of arrangements. You need that license to sign a death certificate, to embalm, and again, they allow interns to do this, and at disposition. And this has been relaxed during the pandemic. I don't know what years ago, like again, up until last year, an intern could not take somebody to the crematory, let's say. This was relaxed a little bit during the pandemic, and I get the feeling that you probably will not see questions about this, but I'm guessing at that. That is an absolute guess. In normal times, if you were to see a question that asked as an intern, can you take somebody to the crematory? No, you cannot. This past year, they've changed that a little bit. So I have a feeling they'll steer away from questions on that. But again, that's an assumption, an absolute assumption on my part. Supervised visitation, dress, casket removal. No, you don't need a license for any of that. You know, you can have somebody that's like, I know a guy that works at a local funeral home who is super competent, man. I would absolutely hand a funeral off to him, or a memorial service, I should say. But he's not licensed. He can absolutely oversee a visitation, even if you're doing the burial the next day and you're there for the burial. But, you know, if you're just having an unlicensed person run the visitation, fine, so be it. Perfectly fine. Dress, casket removal, perfectly fine to do so. All right, so they expect you to remember little things. And some of the things that stick out to me are you should know how much it costs to become an intern, which is a dumb thing, like the $125 that you have to pay to become an intern. There's been questions about that. I think that's such a silly thing, but they ask questions about that. Other things are about biennial license renewal. It's on even years, it's the funeral home, and on odd years, it's for individuals. And the trick I've always used, and if you've had my class on this, you've probably heard me say this before, is that every funeral director I know is an oddball, right? And that's how I always remember that, okay, the individual, the funeral director renews their license on the odd years. On the funeral home, it's for the even years. Renewal expectations to continuing education. You need to know about continuing ed, and we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. License lapse. Now, here's a weird thing. Okay, they changed a bunch of the laws in 2019. There's a regulation called the sunset regulation, meaning that any law in the books has to be reviewed every 7 years to make sure it's still relevant. And in 2019, it came up for funeral service, and they went through and they changed a lot of these regulations. One of the things they changed was what happens if your license lapses. And we'll talk about that here in the next slide. But there was a time interval of 5 years is the magic number. And up to that point, what they required was you would have to go back and do all of that continuing ed and pay all of those past fees. And they switched that a little bit. So we'll talk about that here, like I said, in a second. So new for 2019, these are certain things that they've changed. And I've been running the program at Mercer since 2014. My predecessor, Rob Smith, was there for 34 years. So when this happened, I reached out to him, sort of said, Rob, how fast do you anticipate the changes will happen on the test, on the jurisprudence exam? He estimated 1 to 2 years. He was like, I'm not sure. He's like, I've never really kept track of it that thoroughly because, again, he didn't see the questions either. You can only glean it from what you would get from students and such. So the bunch of stuff changed in 2019. I don't know whether they're going to ask you questions about this or whether they're going to veer away from it completely. So new in 2019, pre-need providers, meaning somebody giving you continuing ed about pre-need, must monitor attendance and ensure completion of the lessons, if there are any lessons. And the CEU instructor must maintain the records for 5 years. Now, when they give us definitive numbers like that, right? 5 years. Those are all good things to remember because those are all things that they could definitely ask you about. And that's a good, it's low hanging fruit. If they ask you, oh, how long does a CEU instructor have to maintain their records? Oh, okay, 5 years. Great. There's no ambiguities to that. So here was the big change of last year, of 2 years ago. You used to be able to have an inactive license. And basically what you would do is you would still pay the fees and your name could be in the advertising. One of the instructors, Paul Paget, at Mercer, super nice guy, but his grandfather is, I want to say in his late 80s, and he had an inactive license and they would still put him in the ads. And the idea was, okay, you're still going to see this guy around at viewings and such. He's not going to be directing funerals, but okay, you'll still see him around and you could keep his name out there to the general public. And they've stripped that all together. As of June 2019, inactive licenses are gone. That's just something that doesn't exist anymore. Now, this is sort of what I was talking about before. License lapses used to be, it used to, what they used to require was you could let your license lapse up to 5 years, and you could come back and make up all the continuing ed you needed up to 25 hours, which makes sense because it's 10 hours per. And then, 5 years is 2.5 cycles. They scrapped all of that and they said, okay, you can still have a license lap up to 5 years, but now they only require the fees and CEUs for the current and previous licensing period. And again, even that's kind of silly because if you're 5 years out, it's only saving you half of a year on that and half of the licensing fees. But they switched and they said, okay, you can charge for this one and the one before, and that's it. So you just had to make up the CEUs up to 20. So if you're out 5 years, it'd be up to 20 CEUs that you had to make up and pay the 2 licensing periods. And again, I really don't know if they're going to ask any questions about this because it's new enough. I get the gut feeling they'll sort of steer away from it, but I can't say. Okay, so here's another odd one. This is one that we normally went over in depth. Lapse of more than 5 years. What they would say, you're out 6 years. You decide life sends you a curveball. You have a kid, you get married, you get into a different line, or whatever, right? Lapse more than 5 years, and you come back and decide I want to get back into funeral service. What they previously said was you have to do a mini internship of 3 months to 1 year, and they would decide like when you applied. 25 funerals and bombings, arrangements, retake and pass the jurisprudence exam and the practical. Now they just say the state board will decide on a case-by-case basis. So there's such a gray area. They make it up on the fly essentially. So again, I can't say you won't see questions on this, but I don't see how they could write a question about this. All right, so things to know about and things to look up. Record keeping, not just a funeral home, because the funeral home, what records do you need to keep and how long do you need to keep them? And it's always important to keep a separation between New Jersey regulations and FTC regulations, because like for the GPL, for example, New Jersey says you need to keep it for 3 years. The FTC only says 1 year. It's okay. Like what? So yeah, I have to always keep that in mind, both when you're taking the jurisprudence exam and if you're taking the national, because the national is going to defer to the FTC. The ideas of itemization. And I know I've been guilty of this before, where you can't just you can't write up a direct cremation and then throw a memorial service on top of it. It doesn't work that way. If you're doing a memorial service, then that's not a direct cremation. You can have packages, but you need to outline everything in those packages. FTC forms for New Jersey compliance. And again, well, let me go back to the record keeping real fast. With the record keeping, look at not only funeral home record keeping, but look at cemetery record keeping. And if anybody needs information on that, feel free to shoot me an email. I've got lists of how long cemeteries need to keep records, how long crematories need to keep records, because they're actually different, and what records they need to keep. How long do you need to keep advertisements? How long do you need to keep general funeral files? And there's a separation there between the 1 year, the initial past year that need to be available immediately, and the other 6 years that need to be available within 2 weeks. Prep room expectations. They've gotten away from this a little bit from what I hear. And again, I only glean answers or questions from students who ask me questions like, oh, what do you think about this particular question? They don't call me up and go, hey, here's 19 questions I remember or something like that. But the equipment that you need, and there's a whole list right in the regulations, and it's things like you need at least 1 aneurysm hook, you need at least 1 scalpel, you need at least 1 drain tube, and the list goes on. There's I would say 17 or 18 items. You should take a look at that and have some ideas about it, have some concept of what is indeed required there. The structure itself, how the idea is such as it has to have 4 walls that go all the way up to the ceiling and all the way down to the floor. It can't just be like a divider that you set up between 2 rooms. The idea that it has to be a room solely for embalming. And the example I use in class, just because it's ridiculous, is you can't have your prep room, but then during viewings, you empty it out and you make it the ladies' restroom. You know, you can't, it has to be a room solely for that. So simple things like that. Which again, I don't think New Jersey really needs to specify that, but they do. All right, FTC telephone price disclosures. New for 2019, the manager may designate an employee, even unlicensed, to provide price info on the phone. So again, my wife who's not licensed, if the manager of the funeral home said, look, you need to, you know, you're our FTC person, or you're our telephone price disclosures person, then, you know, they could obligate her to be, okay, when somebody calls for pricing, you read off of the price list to them. Somebody calls up and asking what it cost me to have a direct cremation. Okay, but she's only really allowed to read off of the price list. You know, she's not allowed to get into a lot of particular details. Now, if somebody called up and said, you know, I want this particular casket, I want a particular layout, I want this particular vault, and they knew specifically what they wanted, she could read off of the price list and give them that information, but she couldn't go as far as to sit down with them and sign paperwork. Responding to questions concerning information not on the price list shall be referred to a license, and this is one of the things that they changed this past year, or intern. So they can set this up to have an intern. I'm going to say wheeling and dealing, but it's not wheeling and dealing in a negative sense, to sit down and work out the specifics. If it's like, okay, I need a little bit more information, they can specify, they can allow both either a licensee or an intern. As an intern, you're allowed to do this. In 2019, they specified a lot more things that interns can do that they could not previously do. All right, so multiple internships or multiple ownership disclosure. A person that owns 50% or greater interest of this registered mortuary also owns 50% or greater interest in the following registered mortuaries in the state of New Jersey. If you own more than one funeral home, you have to disclose this. And you have to give, you know, the name of the funeral home and the municipality. And a description enough to identify, new in 2019, multiple ownership disclosure only needs to be on the GPL. So if you have multiple price lists, if you have a general price list, a casket price list, an outer burial container price list, this disclosure only needs to be on the GPL. Now, this is, and again, this is New Jersey specific, and this is based on the company, not the individual owners, meaning that I owned 3 funeral homes at one point. I actually, technically, I still do own 3 funeral homes. And it was broken up in a way that there was 3 partners. There was myself and 2 other people. I owned 40%. Like if I take the one funeral home, I owned 40%, another person owned 40%, a third person owned 20%. And we initially looked at this when this regulation first popped up. We said, oh, great, we don't need to put that on there. None of us own 50% or more. No. We own 40%, 40%, and 20% of a company that owns 100% of that funeral home. So if this comes up, it has to be disclosed. All right, so mortuary use issues. Again, this is another 2019 thing that they changed, so I don't know if you'll see questions on this. Mortuary should not be used as a site for recovering organs or tissues, including DNA. They relaxed that. For the longest time, the only thing you could give to a family was a lock of hair. That was the only thing you were allowed to do. You couldn't allow blood to be taken, blood samples, body fluids for testing, nothing else, right? Now, they relaxed this in 2019 and said, all right, you can collect DNA via a cheek swab, nail clippings, and or blood collection. So they relaxed that and said, okay, you can go ahead and do that now. And at no, and here's where it gets really murky. Here's where it was really murky. Maybe the site of an examination to determine cause and manner of death. So what the state was previously saying, which they still sort of are, is that okay, you can't take blood samples to collect DNA, et cetera, and so forth, but you can have an autopsy done at the funeral home. It's perfectly legal to have a private autopsy done at the funeral home. It was then and it is now. They just sort of cleaned that up a little bit when they changed the regulations in 2019. Another big one. This one was very big. This was very controversial within the funeral service world. Cannot serve, permit, or allowed to be served on or about mortuary premises any food or refreshments in conjunction with services provided for the prep or disposition of a body. And this was the idea that you could not serve anything but water to people in the building. In 2019, this actually went up to, I loathe Governor Murphy, man. I really think this guy is just a bag of garbage. However, that being said, I agree with him 100%. I really appreciate what he did in this one, because this went up to his office and he actually had to give it the he had to rubber stamp it, and he did. And so in 2019, this was reversed, and you may now serve or allowed to be served food and non-alcoholic beverages, but you cannot prepare them at the funeral home. You're not allowed to actually make them there, right? You can't have a kitchen off to the side where you're cooking up stew or something, right? But you can bring in prepared food to be served there. All right, so if a funeral home closes, did I jump over one? I have continued there. I think that's just a typo. New as of 2019, if you close a funeral home, you have to show evidence to the state board that the EDRS account is closed. You must inform the state board of a location and an individual in charge of the funeral home records. Because again, you're supposed to keep the records for 7 years. So somebody, even if you close today and you're going out of business or you're retiring, those records still need to be available for the next 7 years. So somebody has to be in charge of this. Must keep funeral home records for 7 years, with the first year, and again, just like current records today, the first year available immediately and the other 6 within 2 weeks, right? So they give you 2 weeks, and this is true of an operating funeral home or a closed funeral home. The first one has to be available. The first year has to be available immediately. Like the state board inspector shows up, boom, you have to have it right now. Versus the other 6 years, which they give you 2 weeks. I don't know why, but they say, oh, you could store them off premises. I don't know who has that many records. You can't store them at the funeral home, but hey, it is what it is. All right, interns and intern regulations, preceptor qualifications, and we'll talk about, there's been a little bit of a change to this after 2019, but in general, the standard rule of thumb is they have to be licensed 2 years. How many interns? You may have 2 interns per funeral home. And again, I think this is a really silly regulation. There are funeral homes that have, they're doing 50 calls a year and they could take 2, versus funeral homes that are doing, 2,000 a year and they're only allowed 2. Now, with interns, a funeral home has to have at least 25 funerals per year, not including stillborns, to be able to take an intern. And the basic thought here is that you're required to do the 75, and traditionally it's 75 and 75 funerals, 75 embalmings. If you were to, the 25 embalmings, or I'm sorry, 25 arrangements came on later. But if you were to go back to, let's say, 1975, where almost everybody was buried, if you were doing 25 a year, that would give you, over the course of 3 years, the 75 embalming, 75 funerals that you needed, right? So that's where that 25 per year comes from. Internship extension, internship specifics, times, cases, background. Again, they want you to know that you need to do the 75 and 25, 75 funerals, 75 embalmings, 25 sets of funeral arrangements. The internship extension, by default, your internship is 2 years, right? If you have more than 90 credits, then they will drop that internship requirement down to a 1 year instead of 2 years. You can extend, and they will give you, without question, they will extend for a year, and they'll give you a 3-year internship if it is needed. And the basic idea is this. Traditionally, and again, going back years and years, generations, if somebody gets out of high school, they grew up in the funeral home, they would become a funeral director and someday work with dad or mom or whatever, right? They get out of high school. It's the 2 years of schooling that's required prior to funeral service, plus the 1 year of mortuary school equals the 3 years. Hence the reason they give you that 3. They give you that option to have the 3. The concurrent internship, this is while you're in school, in mortuary school, if you're registered as an intern while you're at mortuary school, that is not a concurrent internship. By definition, it is, but by their definition, it is not. The idea is that I get the whiteboard here. Will that itemized list be on NJ or national? Wendy, I'm sorry, I'm just seeing this now because the chat didn't come up earlier. Itemized list, I'm not sure what you're asking about. If there's if you're talking, I'm guessing maybe about the list of instruments, that would be on the state. Itemized list for the national, I would look to know the I would look to know the 16 items that's required by the FTC. And I would say that you don't need to know them to produce them. You need to know them to recognize them. In that, if I give you a piece of paper and say, write down the 16 items that are required by the FTC, or that if you are offering them, they fall under FTC jurisdiction on a general price list. It's one thing for me to give you a piece of paper and ask you to write them out. It's another thing for you to look at a list and pick them out. So again, for the state, I would know the item. I would know the list of instruments. And again, in a way that you'll be able to pick them out because it'll be multiple choice. They're not asking you to produce the information. They're asking you to identify the information, if that makes sense. So I was thinking about it like this. The why am I not? There's the text. Okay, so there's 2 years of 2 years of schooling that the state of New Jersey requires, right? They don't care what it's in, just that it exists. You can go and do 2 years, 60 credits in basket weaving, and it's perfectly fine as far as the statute is concerned. Plus mortuary science school, right? Mortuary science or funeral service education. Now, the concurrent period, the time of concurrent internship is only during, I drew that really poorly. Let me try that again. That's a little better, but the concurrent period is only during that first 2 years of schooling. And again, it is, you are concurrently doing the internship while you're doing mortuary science education, but the way that they're defining it is at the end of each semester, you have to send a transcript. If you're doing that first 2 years, just during that first 2 years, you have to send, I should draw this a little further over here, but during this first 2 years, you have to send a copy of your transcript at the end of each semester, showing the state board that you're doing at least 8 credits of work. And that's not including remedial education. If you had to do, like, I had to do a remedial math when I did my undergraduate. I stink at math. I still stink at math. And taking a remedial math class would not work towards that 8 credits. So that concurrent internship is just during this first 2 years, right? And again, you are concurrently doing the internship while you're doing the mortuary science education, but they don't consider it that way by their definition. All right, fail state board practical, you have to wait 30 days and pay them the fee again. And concurrent intern, we already talked about. All right, new for interns and preceptors in 2019. And again, I don't know if they're going to be asking questions about this. Preceptors cannot be convicted of a crime within the past 5 years. And then they whittle this down to go, oh, it must be a crime related to funeral service or moral turpitude. And moral turpitude is like something awful, rape or murder or something like that, which would probably cost somebody their license anyway. It's if it's, I don't know, DUI or something, it's not going to count against them. Cannot have revocation, suspension, or surrender of license from any professional board, meaning that I was in my barber shop last month and I noticed his license looked exactly like mine, and we were chit-chatting about it, and he was telling me about the board that he has to deal with, and it's all under consumer affairs. So let's say somebody was a barber and a funeral director, and for whatever reason they're ripping off their clients at the barber shop. Well, they would have to, and then they ended up getting caught. They would they would have to relay that back to the State Board of Mortuary Science. They would know for any professional license that you have, are you under investigation? Has there been a revocation? Has your license been suspended, or anything along those lines? Actually, I say investigation. I shouldn't say that. An investigation would not be the case, because an investigation does not prove guilt. Also new last year, 2 years ago. How time flies. Convictions and arrests new in 2019. Licensees are now required to notify the Mortuary Board in writing within 30 days upon conviction of any crime or arrest, summons, indictment, admission into pretrial intervention, guilty plea to any violation of law, ordinance, felony, DUI, misdemeanor, or disorderly offense in New Jersey or any other jurisdiction. Tickets, speeding tickets are not included in this. So it used to be, up until last year, everybody looked for the minutes of like the licensing period. Like I just renewed, I actually just received my license today. I just got my license renewal in the mail today, my new license. And everybody always looked forward to the February minutes of the state board, because it outlined everybody who got arrested over the past 2 years. And you're like, oh, can you believe this happened? Can you believe this happened? It was great. It was great dirt, man. Actually, a friend of mine, Pat Reynolds, who's a funeral director down in Camden County. The last time this came out, this wasn't that you had to report it every month. Within 30 days of being arrested, he was listed as getting a DUI, and I saw him. I was like, dude, what happened? And he's like, it wasn't me. He was like, there's actually another Patrick Reynolds, and so it was just a coincidence. But people couldn't wait to get their hands on the meetings, the minutes of the meetings every 2 years, just to see the gossip in it. But it's not the case. Now you need to report it whenever it happens. If you get popped on something, you need to report it to the state within 30 days. Again, new for 2019, interns and preceptors. State Board clarified interns' responsibilities. And again, this switched in 2020 by participating. Interns are supposed to participate in funeral arrangements, preservation, washing, or disposal of dead human bodies, making funeral arrangements on behalf of any licensed practitioner of mortuary science on any licensed practitioner of mortuary science, meaning your preceptor is out and there's more than one director there, and the other director is making the arrangements. You can sit in on them, or they can supervise you making those arrangements. That's perfectly fine. Quoting prices when funeral arrangements are being made. Preceptor is responsible for reviewing and executing the statement of funeral goods and services with the intern before providing it to the consumer for review. So again, you're allowed to write the thing up. They need to review it and sign off on it before you give it to them. Interns and advertisements. If intern in ad or website, social media is listed as, and this is cutting off a little bit here because of the little, at least I don't know what you guys see. I see the little Zoom thing. It's supposed to be listed as like John Doe, New Jersey, intern, registration number, and whatever your registration number is. So forms of ownership. Corporate, use of manager name, titles, sign, etc. Remember, there's 3 names that you can go by, 3 titles that you can go by: manager, senior director, or executive director, right? You have to choose one and stick with it. I mean, you could change it every month if you want to, but you need to actually tell the state board you're changing it. I'm not going to be. I worked at a place that had, a former owner. They had sold it to SEI, and they wanted the owner around as much as possible, but he was in retirement and he popped in. He was gone basically 6 months of the year. But hey, God bless him, right? And they wanted to make him senior director and make the guy who actually ran everything the manager. And the state said, no, you can't have more than one. You got to pick one and choose it. They came up with a different, baloney title, president or something like that, just to put on the sign. The name of the manager needs to be listed on either the sign or next to the front door. It does not have to be on both. You pick one or the other, and you can do both. There's nothing wrong with doing both, but it's not required that you do both. Death of the owner, how long do you have to notify the state board of who is going to be the new manager? And look that one up. I believe it's 5 days, but like I said, I intentionally leave my notes out of this one, so I have to guess at it. Just again, it's better if you look it up. New installation. So let's say you move the funeral home. Let's say you move the funeral home one house over. Well, that's a new installation. What if you sell the funeral home? Well, that's actually technically that's a new funeral home. Even if it's Brand X Funeral Home, you buy Brand X Funeral Home, you're buying that name, it's still a new installation. You still need to get an inspection. You need to get a go-ahead by the state. And especially in a new purchase situation, you need to send letters out to everybody in pre-need, everybody who's paid for pre-need. If you close a funeral home, and we'll pick up on this one a little bit, but there's all sorts of stuff that goes along with closing a funeral home, covering the sign, disconnecting the telephone and making sure the state knows that the telephone is disconnected, giving the pre-need ledger over to the state, a copy of the pre-need ledger over to the state. And they have switched this a little bit. They've tweaked this a little bit. And we'll go over that in the next couple of slides. Unlicensed owner. When I grew up, if you're allowed to be an unlicensed owner, there's no reason you have to have a license to own a funeral home. When I was a kid, what happens if you pass the New Jersey State Board exam? I'm sorry, these aren't popping up for some reason. What happens if you pass the New Jersey State Board exam, but don't pass the National Board exam after your 3-year internship is over? Do we continue to constantly send in our numbers for the month? No, if you've hit everything you need for the state, they basically just put you on a holding pattern, and they give you roughly 3 years to right the ship. If you take the jurisprudence exam, it's good for 3 years. And if you can't pass everything else and do the rest of the licensing exams, they basically say, look, you need to redo that JP exam if it's been more than 3 years. Actually, inside of the 3 years, you're normally pretty good. If you go outside of that, that goes almost into that weird gray area that we were talking about before, where the state will go, we'll look at your situation and come up with a specific response for you. But yeah, the 3-year thing, you don't want to go outside of. It's best to stay within the 3 years. If you're having an issue passing the state board, shoot me an email. I'm happy to talk to you about it. But why do insurance agents that do pre-need need a full license? Because you can't have somebody selling pre-need, whether it be insurance or trust or anything else, without that funeral director's license. And here's the basic idea behind it. And I'll tell you my experiences with it. Pennsylvania used to not require a funeral director's license to sell pre-need. Now, you can just sell insurance policies, general policies for whatever, whether that be whole life or whatever the case may be. But if you're selling, they sell goods and services. Essentially, yeah, they sell goods and services, and somebody selling anything regarding funerals, a specific person's funeral, not like, okay, I'm going to put 10 grand aside for someday if I die. My family has it. That's one thing. But if you're buying a specific product, a funeral, it needs to be worked on by a funeral director. When I worked in Pennsylvania, I would deal with cases because they used to not require that in PA. And I worked for a company that was very, very aggressive about this. And I'd open up a case from 5 years, 10 years before, and it would be, the person selling this thing was selling cars last week. They're selling funerals this week. They don't give a shit. They're just trying to close the sale, essentially. and it made for a nightmare, man. I had family saying, oh well, I was told I'll get like $3,000 back, and they actually owed like 1,500 or something. So yeah, that's basically the idea behind it, at least. So and I have lost track of what I was going to say. Okay, unlicensed owners. Let me get back to this. All right, so text. When I was a kid, my parents bought a funeral home. Well, they owned one in like the early 1960s in Camden, and Camden sort of went a little crazy. And so in 1976, they bought a funeral home in Swedesboro, New Jersey. And between 1976 and 1985, it was a daily funeral home. It was owned by my father. He was, my parents, but my father was a licensee manager, and thus it was not considered a trade name because it was under his name. He died in 1985. So between 1985 and 1988, my mom owned it, but she wasn't licensed. She was going to school. So again, at that point, it was a registered trade name. It was Daily Funeral Home, but since she was not licensed, it had to be a trade name. After 1988, she was licensed, and 1988 on, it went back to not being a trade name. It went back to being a sole proprietorship that you could just use that name on it. All right, so pre-need, obviously the idea that, and we were just talking about this, you need to be licensed in New Jersey to sell pre-need. I'm a big fan of that, just because, like I said, I just had bad experiences in Pennsylvania. Signatures on forms. Now, there's a specific breakdown on pre-need forms that you need signatures on both a statement of funeral goods and services. If it's a paid pre-need, you need to have an explanation of where those funds are going. And I think a lot of times we take these for granted, because I think most funeral homes in New Jersey deal with choices, and choices just lays everything out for you. But you need to have, again, a breakdown of specifically where those funds are going, and whose social security number are they going under, especially if it's a trust, because again, that's they'll end up getting a tax statement at the beginning of the year on that. Now, when we talk about trust accounts, the magic number with trust accounts is 200 accounts. If there's a master account and you have 200 accounts in there, at that point, you're allowed to take 1% of the total interest, I should say, to run it. They figure at that point you've got enough paperwork that needs to go out monthly and yearly that you need to hire someone to be able to oversee that. Change of funeral homes, look up this date. I believe it's 14 days. I could be wrong on that. It could be 10. Like I said, I intentionally leave my notes out of this just so you have to look it up, not to be a jerk, but it's that much better if you look it up. So a funeral home contacts you and says, I don't like you anymore. I want to go to brand X. How long do you have to move those funds? The pre-need ledger. What information needs to be in the pre-need ledger? And I'll give you a couple of examples of things that need to be in there. Yeah, the name, the date that it was started, the amount that they initially put in, the interest that's accumulated. But there's one or two other things, and like I said, without the full list in front of me, I'm not intentionally denying you of it. I just find it better to look this stuff up. Cancellation fee you cannot have on, which again is a good thing. It's all about consumer confidence. When somebody wants to leave, they take all of their money plus all interest gained. Outside of that 1%, if it is a pooled trust, 1% of interest, not 1% of the corpus of it. And again, that idea 100% pre-need trust, you can't keep 10% of it for yourself. And you guys will see this. You'll spend, if you do pre-need, there are times you'll spend hours with people, right? You can't go, well, I spent 5 hours with them, I want to keep like $100. You're not allowed to. It's just not. They don't allow it. So trust issues, got a little ahead of myself. So 200 accounts is when you when that trust can take 1% of the interest earned to fund itself. Commissions are not allowed, except there's always that exception, right? Except for if there is, except for if you're dealing with insurance. And if you write newly issued insurance policies, you're allowed to get a commission on it. The reason they make that distinction is many times people will come in and they'll have dad's life insurance, right? And here's how much it's worth. And you end up calling the company and seeing what the death benefit is versus the cash amount. And if it's close enough, you end up cashing it out or writing it into a new insurance policy. If you are cashing it out, again, if you're just taking a newly existing policy and cashing it out, you can't take a commission on it. If you're writing a newly issued insurance, the insurance company is allowed to issue you a commission so long as you disclose that to the family. You don't have to disclose to them how much that commission is, just that you're taking a commission. POD accounts, payment on death account. I've had students over the years that have said, yeah, we use POD accounts. We write up a statement of funeral goods and services, send the people down to the bank, and they set it up, and they just go, okay, well, we'll pay this amount per month. And, you know, the bank says, well, when the death happens, come down with a death certificate, give it to us, and we'll give you the cash in here. That's perfectly legal. It's not nearly as common as putting into a trust or into insurance, but it's still perfectly legal. All right, so new in 2019, you must notify social services when any refund on an irrevocable prepaid funeral is issued. So it used to only be $500 and up. So the idea being the trust performed very well. It was irrevocable. There's $400 left. Here you go. Just take the 400 and scram. Don't worry about it. And the state was just like, all right, whatever. Now, if there's 25 cents left, you need to notify social services that, oh, yeah, I issued a check for a quarter back to this family. All right, so advertising. Name has to be as registered. If you're Brand X Funeral Home this week, you can't go, wow, I like Brand X Memorial Home. You know, I want to run it like that. It doesn't, it's even a minor difference like that. You would have to go through the nonsense of changing your name with the state board. The manager has to be listed, the manager's license number. The exception is novelty items, 2 lines or less, being like a pen or my uncle owned a funeral home, and he used to put on to tees, golf tees. They drive. I don't play golf. I know nothing about golf, but the little tees they put the golf ball on when they drive. And he used to put on there like Bud Funeral Home, Woodbury, New Jersey, and he used to just take handfuls of them and throw them out at the. I'm going to call it a tee box. I don't know what it's actually called. I don't golf, but you throw tons of them out at every one of these things he went to. And the idea was people would pick it up and say, oh, Bud Funeral Home. If it's 2 lines or less, if it's a small item where you can't get everything into it, then that's perfectly fine. You can just put in the municipality and the funeral home name, a logo and an obit. Now, I don't know how common this is in other parts of the state. I'll go back to that in a second. I picked this one just randomly out of the Courier Post. And I think the Courier Post and the Camden County Courier Post was the big, I'm going to say offender, but this is where it happened a lot. Funeral homes were running like their full images of like, you know, whatever their symbol was, their name and all this other information in the bottoms of obits. I remember there was one that had like a it'd be like, you know, John Smith, blah 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 blah. Services are memorial donations too, blah blah. And then at the bottom there'd be this whole section where it'd be like a lighthouse, and the lighthouse beaming light out. It's like, we are your bridge over troubled water. All this other stuff was based in it. And the state board, this is probably 06, 07, said, yeah, no way. No, you can't make people pay for that because you pay by letter and line in an obit. You're making families pay for your advertisement. So no, you can't do that. So if you have an image like this, which is perfectly fine to do, it just the funeral home has to pay for that. And since that's technically an ad, it falls under all the other ad regulations, meaning you have to have the name of the funeral home and the manager's name and all the other things that are required in an ad. And again, I picked Chinuski just by chance. I was just gone through the paper and said, okay, testimonials. If you have a testimonial from a celebrity that's or anybody, they have to have actually used your funeral home. You can't just have, I know I live around the corner from FC Kerbeck, and they used to have like every baseball player on the Phillies. They would have them, in their ads. In fact, when I first started teaching this class, I made a joke about Nick Foles, who was quarterbacking at the time for the Eagles. And one of my students who was a Patriots fan said, Nick Foles is done, blah, 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 blah. And I was so happy to send him an email after Nick Foles beat the Patriots in the Super Bowl back in 2018. 2018. Yeah. It's a proud day. But in any sense, I couldn't have just Nick Foles in a testimonial for us unless we actually buried or handled somebody in his family. Price reductions. This is another strange one. So here's the idea. You're not allowed to have, all right, I'm gonna close this. Agents, they say, okay. All right. So you're not allowed to have if you're offering a price reduction, in a price reduction situation, the price cannot be higher, cannot be altered. I misspelled that. 30 days prior. So here's the idea. They don't want you altering. If you're offering something for sale and you're advertising it, you can't have that price altered 30 days prior. Here's the thought on it. I've got a casket that I'm selling for $100, right? I would sell the casket at $100. On here on Thursday, I raised the price to $200. But run an ad offering it for half price at only $100, right? So that's what their concern is. So if I was going to do something like this, I'd have to wait at least 30 days to be able to do it. Right. So the idea that I go, oh, look, I raised up to 200. Then I run an ad. You come in today, you can get it for half off. You come in and prepay with me today, you'll get it at half price. Well, you're really not getting it at half price. It's just I've jacked the price up and I'm dropping it back now. All right. Advertising includes any way that you put yourself out in front of the public in any way, shape, or form. Aerial displays. I've never seen an aerial display for a funeral home, like when you're at the beach and there's like Eat at Joe's or something, the plane flying by, but they included in it again because they go overkill in New Jersey. Circulars, handbills, flyers, letters, any other similar item, document, publication, or device used to communicate to the general public or to a specific group. And in 2019, they extended this to the funeral home website and social media, which makes sense. Again, it's a way for you to disseminate information and put it in front of the public, and send a specific message to them. All right, so fines. Fines can run the gamut, but the absolute maximum that they can do on a first offense of something is really just absolutely egregious. Let's say you stealing a bunch of pre-need or something. The absolute ceiling on this is $10,000 for the first. For the second and subsequent offenses, it's $20,000. That's the absolute maximum if you're doing something that's awful. Now, they can also pop you for investigative charges. If they have to bring in somebody to investigate you, to go through your records, the state's not paying for it. So they can always tack those things on. But the standard ceilings on these things is $10,000 for the first if it's really egregious, and $20,000 for the second. All right, interment, etc. And again, look these things up. It's like I said, I'll give you some information here, but I found better student success when you actually look these things up. The depth of burial. If it's a casket, it's essentially 4 feet of earth need to be on top of the casket. And I always remember this by, if you think of a casket as being about 2 feet high, I know it's probably more than that, but if you think of a casket being about 2 feet high, that would be 6 feet under, but 4 feet of earth need to be on top of a casket, unless it is in a proper burial vault, in which case there is no necessary depth that you need to hit. It could be at 1 inch. The top of the vault can be out. Don't mind my kid running around. It just comes down to that burial vault. Temporary burial. There is a whole series of regulations regarding temporary burial. And if you mark let's say that you're burying someone, but they're building a mausoleum, they will give you up to 4 years to temporarily bury someone. You put them, you bury them now, and then they'll be able to be moved in that mausoleum later. If you do this, a funeral director does not even need to be there when they do the disinterment, but it has to be marked as such from the beginning. Multiple burials. If you are, and this is burying 2 people in 1 casket, you are allowed to do that with the permission of, and it's the same normal next to kin breakdown, where it's like spouse, majority of children, etc. But they include at the top of this the decedent. And so the idea is, if a woman is giving birth and she's dying, and the child is dying during childbirth, and she says, I want the child buried with me. Okay, that's good enough permission. They're allowed to do that. I had a student a couple of years ago that had a husband and wife that somebody broke in their house. They just bought a new house and they're painting, and the guy broke in and somehow had a gun and shot them both or something, and stole their car and then overdosed. So by the next morning, both of these people were dead. The guy who actually did it was dead as well, which is an awful situation. But he was saying that they had this huge casket, and both families decided that they wanted them buried together. That's perfectly acceptable and perfectly legal to do, so long as you have the approvals to do so. Disinterment, if you're talking about multi-death burials, nope, wrong one. New share. If you've got, there we go. All right, so if this is a grave, all right, I'm terrible at drawing. And let's say you've got 2 people buried here. You want this person disinterred. You need all the same signatures for this person. It's 7 signatures in total for a disinterment, but you need to get all of them for this person on top before you can get to this person here. Disinterment, one of the odd things about it legally is somebody dies and it's their spouse. They have total control over the method of disposition. Once they're buried, it's both the spouse and all adult children that have equal say on what is to be done with that disinterment, which I've never understood that. I've never understood that legislation, but it is what it is.
Professor?
Yes.
Can you repeat that? I think the last thing you said just got cut out.
Sure. Absolutely. If somebody is interred, if somebody is buried, before they're buried, you're allowed to, it's just the spouse. So if you're married, your spouse has total control over what happens to your remains. Once you're buried, it is equal amongst the spouse and all adult children. So let's say it's spouse number 2, right? Let's say it's wife number 2, the husband dies. Let's say there's 5 kids. The kids are from the first marriage. They don't like the new wife. They could overrule her and just go, yeah, well, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna disinter, and there's nothing you can do about it legally. It's an odd law. All right, so crematory, presence of a licensee. Now, normally you would need a presence of a licensee to take somebody to the crematory. During the pandemic, they relaxed this, which is, I think it's a good step, but I don't know if they're going to touch this as far as questioning is concerned. I don't know. In normal times, as an intern, you're not supposed to be able to take somebody to the crematory. Under these situations, they allow for it. Record keeping. Take a look at the requirements of the record keeping. And if you took laws, rules, and regulations, there's a particular slide that breaks this down and says specifically what the crematory needs to keep. And again, this doesn't make sense. We're not crematories, but they expect you to know this for testing purposes. And there's things like the name of the person, the date of death, what is ultimately happening to the cremated remains, what's the funeral home, and what they mean by what's happening to the cremated remains. Are they going back to the funeral home? Are they going to the family? Are they being scattered by the crematory? Are they being sent out to sea by the crematory? But there's a whole breakdown of this. Unclaimed cremated remains. After 1 year, as a funeral home, you're allowed to do away with unclaimed cremated remains. You're allowed to, as long as you make your due diligence to try to contact somebody in the funeral home. And the rule of thumb on that is to send 1 or usually 2 letters that they have to sign for, and certified letters. And then if they don't get back to you by a certain point, end up taking them and disposing of them respectfully. You can't just go, well, your family didn't want you to know why I'm throwing you in the trash. If you have a service, or not have a service, but you have them buried, interred at a cemetery, if you have them scattered somewhere, all of those are accepted terms to be able to get rid of unclaimed cremated remains. For reality, every funeral home I know just holds on to them, and you end up with a closet somewhere with like 50 of them in it. It's just sort of the way that it is. But by the letter of the law, you can get rid of them. All right, so here's a whole bunch of things that they changed in 2019. I don't think they're going to question you on these, but I just figured I would include them. New for 2019, statement at the top. This statement is subject by agreement of both parties, or this statement is subject to change by the agreement of both parties, giving us sort of an out as far as and it's not even a contract. The statement of funeral goods and services is not a contract. And I think they're just sort of making that obvious. The check boxes for sex were removed because sex and gender over the past 15 years become a little bit more complicated than it was previously. So male and female is not there. It just says this, okay, sex, sanitary care without embalming has been changed to other prep of body. Use of facilities and staff for viewing to visitation has been switched. It initially was just for viewing. It's now over to visitation. Added to use of equipment and staff for graveside, the line including accompaniment of remains to place of final disposition. So just some wording, some verbiage that they've changed. I like I said, I kind of doubt you're going to see any of this on the test, but I just felt it was important to include it. Receiving 40 remains on different lines. It used to just be one line, and you would pick one of them if you were doing it. Optional package service. If an optional package service is selected, categories 1 through 3 are not applicable. 2, if you select an optional package, see general price list for a list of included services. Now, the question that came up on this was, if this is the case, that initially it said, if an optional package service is selected, categories 1 through 3 are not applicable, to switching it over to, if you select an optional package, see general price list for a list of included services. The first question everybody said was, great, then we can have a direct cremation and include a memorial service with it, right? Because you get a price shopper, you go, look, here's what I sort of want to do, try and get my price as low as possible. And the state came back and said, no, you cannot. A direct cremation specifies in that package that you're not doing any services. So yeah, they put the kibosh on that pretty quickly.
Professor.
Yes, go ahead.
if a family, let's say you're doing a removal and they're not sure what they want to do, but they give consent for you to embalm because they may want to have a viewing. Then next day they come in, they say they rather just do a direct cremation. Are you allowed then to have them on the statement of goods mark it as being a direct cremation, but also have the additional charge for the embalming that you just did?
Wow, that's a good question, man. That's a really good question. Whew. I'm going to say yes.
Okay.
And I'm basing this on the fact that you were given permission to embalm. You didn't make the assumption of that. You were given the authorization to do so. All right, I'm going to say yes, but chances are the prudent thing to do would be to write it up as all of your individual services being, removal, transportation to the crematory, basic services of funeral director and staff, et cetera, and so forth. That would be the prudent thing to do. However, I think you could squeak that one by because you were given authorization to do so.
Daily?
Yeah.
I'm thinking that when I was studying for the national test, I came across that. And I think it says you can't, I believe I read, you can't mandate a family pay for embalming when they select a disposition that does not require embalming.
Well, you can't do it if you have not been given permission to do
Even
so.
if they give them permission. So they come in and they say, you're right, we want to do it. Now, where's the direct cremation? But I don't know if you'd be able to mandate they had to pay if they selected a disposition that didn't require it.
No, again, but the difference is they've given you authorization to do so. Therefore, like let's play it out a little bit further. Family comes in, they buy a casket, they want to have a 3-day layout, whatever, right? You lay the body out, you do the dressing, casting, cosmetology. It's an autopsy case, and you spend 3 hours prepping, et cetera, and so forth. Person's in the casket, they come in the day of the viewing and go, no, cancel everything. We want a direct cremation at this point. You can't be expected to not be paid for your time and your services. You know what I mean?
That's not a direct cremation. You've done other stuff before that.
Well, the same thing with the situation that was laid out before. You make a house call at 10 p.m. You go out there, they go, yeah, we think we're gonna have a viewing, whatever. And you ask specifically, may I embalm the decedent? You take the decedent back, you embalm them, you prep them, and you're there until 2 a.m. prepping. The next morning at 10 a.m., they come in and say, no, we changed our mind and we just want a direct cremation. Okay, that's fine, but you've already taken the time and your skills to embalm that body. There's no reason the funeral home should not be compensated for that. See what I mean? I'm just taking it a step further.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. It's a good scenario, though. I'll tell you, it's a really good scenario, man. That's a really good scenario. I might bounce that one off of Rob Smith. See what he says. He tends to be an expert on these things, on regulatory compliance. So, all right. So other wording changes. These are minor changes. Clergy or church to officiate in place of worship. Newspaper notice to obituary charges. Pallbearer has been removed, but you can write that in if you choose to into cash advances. Price reduction removed, but can be written above grand total, meaning you get a line here that says total, a blank line, and then grand total. So if you want to write in reduction, if there's a package reduction. All right, miscellaneous concepts, where to file the death certificate. Again, the municipality of death, municipality of funeral home, municipality of disposition. Cost of the permit being $5. The only thing I've ever seen dropped from a state entity in my life, where normally it was 15, and they said that they needed 15 to build the EDRS system, and they said we'll drop it down to 5 and we get it built. And they actually did it. They actually dropped it back down to 5. So renting a funeral home to another, you need a special use permit on this. This happens all the time, and it happens illegally. Nobody enforces it, and it is what it is. But for testing purposes, you need a special use permit to do this. And you need to write to the state board and say, okay, me, Brand X Funeral Home, I am renting Brand Y Funeral Home. You can't be Joe Schmo funeral director doing this, because you can't just advertise yourself as a funeral director. You need to advertise yourself as a funeral home. If I just stepped out and said, I want to do business here in my town, said, just call my cell number, I wouldn't have a location. I wouldn't have paperwork, statement of funeral goods and services, general price list, casket prices, everything else. You need a location to be able to do all of that. So it's one location renting another location. And again, this happens all the time illegally, and that's fine. I'm not even complaining about that. I'm just saying, before one funeral home rents another, you need to have that proper in theory, and again, it doesn't happen in practicality, but you need to have that special use permit in place. Again, and if you're renting a funeral home, if you know, the Daily Funeral Home is renting Brand X Funeral Home, I cannot mention Daily Funeral Home unless I mention Brand X Funeral Home. So it would have to be, services are at Brand X Funeral Home, 321 Main Street, under the care of Daily Funeral Home, right? You can't do the one without the other. If you wanted to mention neither of them, that's fine, because when say services are at 321 Main Street, that's perfectly fine, but you cannot mention the one without the other. Now, receiving vaults. This is a very antiquated concept. I mentioned my predecessor, Rob Smith, earlier. He was licensed, I think, in 1970 or 71. And when I first started teaching law and stuff, I kept coming across stuff of receiving vaults. And I called him up and I was like, what the hell is a receiving vault? I've never seen, what is this? And he explained to me what it is a place if you show up, in especially if you're in a place like Maine, right, in like February, they can't dig into the ground because it's so cold. So they have a receiving vault where they hold the bodies until then. And I asked him if he ever saw one. He was like, yeah, I saw one, like in my first year of being licensed. I've never seen another one. It's such an antiquated notion, but the idea is you hold on to a decedent for a couple of months until the ground falls, and there's a bunch of regulations about this, and it's just good to know them. I doubt you'll see a lot of maybe one, but it's one of those things that's worth looking up. It has to be at least 5 feet underground, or designed in a way to prevent the escape of noxious fumes or odors if you have an unembalmed body in there for more than 48 hours. So, and this is not one that popped up a couple years ago. Somebody went into a funeral home and they noticed down the sleeve they could see duct tape around plastic, and they got upset and they contacted the state board, and the state board does a knee-jerk reaction where they said every prep room has to have not just duct tape in it, but it has to have clear white or flesh-colored adhesive tape, which everybody said, what the hell is flesh-colored? How do you define that? And they're like, oh, people can define that themselves. We're like, oh, okay, great. But it just came from a knee-jerk reaction of somebody making a complaint because they saw duct tape on the plastic down somebody's sleeve. All right, welfare versus Medicaid. So the amount, you have to know the amounts because there's what is it? It's stillborn to 6 days, 6 days to 2 years, and then 2 years up to adulthood. And there are different numbers for each. If I pull my wife in here, she would know them. Like the adults, 2246. What the the family is allowed to contribute 1570, I believe, and I think to the cemetery it's 540. I could be wrong in that last number, but there's different numbers for each, and you should know each of them. The form to use for that is the PA 13, which then became the NFNJ 13. So 13 or 36. Let me check. Hold on. PA 11. PA 11, my wife knew it. So the PA 11, which then became the WFNJ 11, which was Public Assistance 11, which I've had students, I've posed them this question, and they've said, yeah, I've seen both on the test. WFNJ is Work First New Jersey 11. Where's the claim submitted? It's at a county level. Because I know I deal with Burlington County, which is pretty easy, and then Camden County, which is an absolute nightmare to deal with. Yeah, Gloucester's very easy. Salem's easy as well. Yeah. Emergency burial permit. So it used to be before EDRS, if there was a long weekend and you needed to have somebody buried for religious or other reasons, you would need to go before a judge and get an emergency burial permit. EDRS has pretty much rendered this not necessary anymore, but in theory, you can get an emergency burial permit by going before a judge. If you're in a cemetery where there is no person in charge of the cemetery, the funeral director is in charge of reporting the deaths and taking care of the burial permit. Communicable disease list and reporting. There's a list of, I believe, 5 diseases. And if you have any of them, if somebody has plague, for example, it has to report it to the Department of Health within 12 hours. Now, all of this stuff is in theory. Yellow fever is one of them. And I had a student when I was going through this, and they're like, yeah, we had a body with yellow fever last week. We didn't report anybody. If you tried to report these to the Department of Health, they wouldn't know what to do with it. They say, what the hell are you talking about? But in theory, they can ask you questions about this. Report veterans' death. So this is an interesting one that you'll probably never see in your career. Here's what this involves. If you make a removal out of state, right? So you drive it to Pennsylvania or New York and you get a body and you bring it back and the person happens to be a veteran and you happen to be going to a cemetery with nobody in charge, right? One of these small municipal cemeteries, little town cemeteries that nobody runs, nobody works there. You haven't had a burial there since 1963, and you've got to bury somebody there. Then it falls to the funeral director to report that veteran's death to the county official who is in charge of veterans' death. The idea being on Veterans Day, Memorial Day, they like to go out and put flags on these graves. And the cemetery would normally report this, but since the death happened out of state and it's not on EDRS and nobody's in charge of that cemetery, it falls to the funeral director to actually report it. Again, something you'll never see in your career, but chances are you could see questions about this.
Professor?
Yes, go ahead.
Is COVID-19 considered a communicable disease that has to be marked on a cremation authorization?
No, it's not one of the ones. That's not one of the, well, nothing really needs to be marked on the cremation authorization by regulation. If your crematory has regulations that they ask you to do in order to do business with them, that's one thing. But there's nothing in the regulatory code that says you need to tell anybody anything about any deaths. That regulation goes back to reporting it to the Department of Health. So, if you're dealing with brand X crematory and they go, look, we would really like to know if somebody has X, Y, or Z, then that's one thing. And even that's a little bit of a gray area, releasing medical information like that. But if a crematory asks for something like that or says, we'd like you to take these certain steps, if somebody has and in the crematory we are dealing with one of the boxes sealed up and taped and sealed, and they just said across the board, just do all of them and seal all of them down like this. So they weren't asking for particular, health information about any particular person. But yeah, no, that's not something that's really codified. That's more just something that a crematory may be asking for that information.
Is that the same for if they're asking for pacemakers if they have them, or is that
that's a little bit different because that sort of falls in a way that falls under OSHA, because you can't put somebody into a situation where they're going to open up a retort and have the chance of a pacemaker exploding and somebody being injured as a result of it. So they have a little bit more of a leeway in asking questions like that, just because they'll be at physical risk as a result if they don't know that information. You know what I mean?
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely. So EDRS, I think everybody's familiar with EDRS now. It's some of these notes are from my predecessor, and just knowing that EDRS exists. Burial at sea, and what are the requirements for burial at sea? If you look in, and again, for Mercer students, and I'm sure that if you go to a different school, you probably had the same textbook that we had in the supplement for Mercer students. There's a breakdown on what you need to do for burial at sea. For everyone else, there is a book that what is the name of it? I think it's out of Dallas Institute, and I think it's funeral services and something along those lines, where it breaks down each funeral service. If you're in a Catholic church, do it like this; Protestant church or a Lutheran church, do it like this; if you're doing a Buddhist service, do it like this. And in the beginning of that, there's a breakdown of what you need to do as far as burial at sea. And there's so much ballast you have to put in, and so many holes that you need to drill into the casket. It's good to know. I have not gotten a lot of questions, or I have not gotten a lot of feedback saying they see that, but it's not a bad review beforehand. Signatures, what signatures need to be on the death certificate, what signatures need to be on disinterment permit. And the death certificate is 3 or 4, and the disinterment actually 7. What signatures need to be on the statement of funeral goods and services. FTC disclosure disclaimer, there's really, you're not required to have one of those, but if you had one, normally it'd be the funeral director and the whoever's making the arrangements. UAGA, this Uniform Anatomical Gift Act. This basically gives complete control to whoever has the remains. We have an anatomical donor program at Mercer, and when somebody signs the remains over to us, they completely bequeath the remains to us. And we're not holding on to them like we would at a funeral home. We have complete legal control over those remains. If somebody called me up and said, I want mom's remains back to do whatever, I've changed my mind, I could say, go pound sand. I would never do that. But the idea is that I always use the example of, we were dealing with a company that takes bodies, and it takes them months to do it. They shave off just a millimeter and they recreate it digitally, and they do that like 100,000 more times, and they can take an entire body and recreate it in a digital format. You can go into a program and you can go through any of the different systems in the body. You can get the different bones, the different muscles, whatever you wanted to. You couldn't be halfway through that and ask for the remains back. Like, it's just not, it doesn't work that way, So it gives groups who take remains for medical purposes the right to take full legal possession of them. And victims of crime compensation, again, this is, families can get up to, I think it's 5,000 or 6,000 now. It might even be 7,000 now. If you ever have somebody that dies of or it's killed of murder or something, you can get this funding, and it's God, you hate to deal with a family that has had a murder in the family, but it really helps people out. Medical waste, and the idea that funeral homes have to be a medical waste generator, a regulated medical waste generator. General wills terminology. All right, so these are, again, this is dumb because we don't make embalming fluids, but these are the compounds that are restricted from using embalming fluids. The idea that they would want people poisoning each other. And these are the communicable diseases, the 5 communicable diseases: smallpox, cholera, yellow fever, typhus, and plague. If somebody has one of these, if you pick a body up that has one of these, you're supposed to notify the Department of Health within 12 hours. Again, if you did, the Department of Health wouldn't know what to do. I mean, it's one of these things, it's codified, it's in the regulation. Nobody really enforces it, but you need to know it for testing purposes. I think that's the last of it. Yeah, that's the last of it. All right. All right. PA 11. Thank you. That's why funeral home ad answering embalming tone removal forms. That makes sense. Can you, if creating after visitation in days? PA 11, you're right. PA or WFNJ 11. Explain this to everyone. How do you get permission? Grave opening if no one runs a cemetery. You end up contacting the township and getting permission to open, and then just getting a grave digger in. So, you know, a vault company will normally come in and do it for you. When they already know from hospice. I don't know. What are you asking, Wendy? Wouldn't they already know if they had one of those diseases? Not necessarily, no, because a hospital is not going to contact anybody to release that information.
So would they contact the state or the health CDC or any of those agencies?
No, because I mean, all of this regulation was written in the 1940s. Well, much of it was written in the 1940s, long before HIPAA. You know, HIPAA was what, 76, 77, and it wasn't even enforced till the mid 90s. So yeah, it just wasn't. It was one of these situations. They put it in there, and they've never removed it, although they should. So it's, you know, the if somebody has one of those diseases, the hospital isn't going to call anybody and tell them, but the funeral home for some reason is expected to. Although it's not practical, or really, I'd even argue legal for you to be able to.
Well, wouldn't it be on the death certificate of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I'm saying. It's one of these weird, useless regulations that I guess in 1948 or 49 when they wrote it, they had good intentions, but you know, it's, you wouldn't, if you get that death certificate signed maybe what, a day, 2 days after the death, then the idea is at that point they're going to give you 12 hours to notify the Department of Health, who doesn't know what to do with this information anyway. It doesn't, it's, the whole thing is silly. And after you're licensed, you can promptly forget it, but it's just one of those things for testing purposes. It's good to know. Any other questions? Anybody? You know, please feel free. All right, going once, going twice, going three.
Only prep before the test, before the state exam.
I'm sorry, what was that before the state exam?
Is this the only prep course or refresher before?
This is the only thing. This is the only thing I offer, but I don't know if any of the other schools do. I sent emails out to all of them. I heard back from one of them, so I don't know if anybody else does anything.
Thank you.
Sure thing. When will this access be recording? Probably later tonight or tomorrow. What happens is when I finish here, it has to download to my computer, which normally takes a half an hour or so, and then I have to upload it to YouTube. And like I said, I'll make it public, and it's MCCC Funeral Service Program, and that'll probably take 20 minutes or so, 10 minutes, 15 minutes to upload. I may get to it, I may not. As you guys have probably seen, I've got a 5 and a 2-year-old running around here. So I'll probably be hanging out with them tonight. So if not tonight, it'll be up tomorrow. And my email address is in there. It's dailym@mccc.edu. And if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me. If you went to another program, it's not a problem. I want to see everybody pass the test. I want everybody to get licensed. And I hope everyone enjoys the profession as much as I have. So,
Professor,
yes.
are they the jurisprudence exam? Are there 2 days that they're offering it at Mercer, or is it only the 18th?
I'm being told that it's 2 days, but you're probably just being given 1 day. And what they're doing is they're trying to space it out over 2 days. And let's say they've got 20 people taking it, they'll tell 10 people to take on the 18th, 10 people to take it on the 19th, and spread it out just so you have less people in the room.
Is it like because I saw I got the email from for the requirements, and they said bring number 2 pencils. Is it going to be one of those things where they run it through the Scantron and you'll know your score immediately, or will they tell it you later?
Here's what happens. You guys take it, they leave, they run it through, and then they send that information to the state board. Cindy is normally pretty good. I normally reach out to Cindy a day or two after, and she'll tell me the scores on it. So if anybody wants to know their score, email me. I'll contact Cindy. I'll try and get your score for you. And again, even if you didn't go to Mercer, it's fine. I can reach out. She'll give me the scores on it. If not, that's fine. She'll mail them out to you, but it's normally a week or two later that you get them. And right now in particular, they're taking a long time getting this stuff out because she's only in on Thursdays, from my understanding is. That sounded exciting.
Oh, That's Vincent. I'm telling him that I'm giving him that.
Okay.
He's busy now. He just had a kid, so
I got you.
he's
I got you.
a little busy.
Yeah. Ooh, that'll do it, man. That will do it. So yeah, like I said, I normally try and get them as soon as I can from Cindy. I know that the situation has been changing a lot, and because I've been in touch with Susan Collins, who runs the testing center, and they've been trying to. It's been a very fluid situation where they've been switching what they've been doing the whole time just to accommodate the whole COVID thing. So I don't know all of the specifics on it, but my guess would be, and somebody put in there 18th and the 25th. So it sounds like there'll be one on the 18th, one on the 25th. So it's like I said, I have to take your word for it. If I was on campus, I'd be able to tell you exactly, but I haven't been on the campus in any regularity for a year now. So,
Yeah, it's basically, and also you have to fill out that MCCC symptom tracker.
yeah.
24, 48 hours before you go and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that silly COVID tracking form. Yeah, whenever, and you guys got robbed with Lab. We're at least on every other week now with Lab. We actually had an embalming last week or 2 weeks ago, and it's and they make us fill that thing out. And if they haven't filled it out, they can't be there. So, and Patrick Smith, thank you, and thank you to you as well. And are there any other questions? Otherwise, it's 7:40. I'm going to take my 2-year-old and put her to bed. But I don't want to rob anyone if you have any questions or anything.
If I have any other questions, I'll shoot you an email.
Yeah, please feel free. And again, that goes for you as well as anybody else. If you go to another school, I don't care. Feel free to reach out to me. It's not a problem. I wish you guys all the best. And please let me know how you make out on it, okay? I'm going to finish
Thank
my
you.
beers. Good for you, Pat. Take it easy, everyone.